"Sir, I need you to sit down right now." The flight attendant's voice was thin and strained, stretched almost to breaking by rising panic. She stood in the aisle of the Boeing 777 with her arms slightly raised, as if bracing herself. Harold Lawson, 83, didn't react. He stayed on his feet, a steady, unmoving figure in the growing disorder of the cabin. His pale blue eyes weren't focused on her, but on the flickering emergency lights above. Beside the attendant, a Federal Air Marshal in a wrinkled suit stepped forward. His expression carried forced authority. "You heard her, sir. Take your seat. This is now a federal matter." His hand drifted toward the outline beneath his jacket, the motion clearly meant as a warning. Harold finally shifted his gaze, meeting the Marshal's eyes for a brief, steady moment. There was no fear there, just a tired calm that seemed to unsettle the younger officer even more. Everything had unraveled quickly. A sharp, acrid smell of overheated electronics. A sudden jolt, followed by cascading system failures. The main cabin lights flickered out, replaced by the dim orange glow of the floor emergency strips. The entertainment screens went dark. But the most alarming part was the silence from the cockpit. For 10 minutes, the flight crew had tried to reach the captain. Their increasingly urgent knocks on the reinforced door were met with nothing. The aircraft now felt like a drifting vessel at 37,000 feet, and the passengers were beginning to break under the pressure. A woman behind Harold was crying openly. A businessman kept yelling into a dead phone. The air held the metallic edge of fear. The Marshal, Agent Fuller, seemed convinced that controlling the situation meant pressuring the only passenger who wasn't panicking. "I won't ask again," Fuller said, his voice low and tense. Menacing. He stepped closer, crowding Harold's space. "We may have a cockpit issue or crew incapacitation. The last thing I need is a confused passenger roaming the aisle." When Harold finally spoke, his voice was rough but steady, cutting through the background noise. "The transponder is off." Fuller frowned. "What?" "The plane's transponder. It's not sending our position," Harold repeated, his eyes distant as if focused on something beyond the cabin walls. "And we've shifted course. We're turning slightly southeast, off our route to Chicago." Fuller's expression tightened. The old man was either unusually observant or completely mistaken. Fuller chose to assume the latter. "How would you even know that? Did you catch that on your little screen before it went dark?" "Sit down. Now." Harold didn't react. He was listening to the engines, his head tilted slightly. Something in the sound was off. The right engine wasn't running smoothly. A faint vibration pulsed up through the floor into the soles of his worn shoes. He had spent a lifetime understanding how machines behave under stress, and this one was failing. "The flight crew needs to close off the forward galley," Harold said, his tone calm but firm, leaving no room for debate. "There's a fire in the main avionics bay beneath the cockpit. That's why they're not answering. They're probably already down. The fumes would have hit them first." The flight attendant gasped, covering her mouth. Fuller's suspicion hardened into anger. "That's it. You're done," the Marshal hissed. He grabbed for Harold's arm. "You're causing panic. You're becoming a threat to this flight." Harold didn't move. He simply stood there. He glanced down at the hand that was about to clamp onto his thin arm. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but carrying an old, steady weight. "You don't understand what a real threat to this flight looks like. But you will soon if you don't let me help." The cabin trembled again, this time with sharper force. A wave of screams rose from the passengers. The aircraft was failing, and the crew seemed just as confused as everyone else. Fuller recognized the panic building through the rows and realized that grabbing an elderly man might spark a full-scale outburst. He lowered his hand, though his eyes warned him that this wasn't over. Pointing a shaking finger at Harold, he said, "Stay right there. Don't move. Don't say anything," before turning toward the rest of the cabin, trying to appear steady even though he wasn't. "Everyone please stay calm. We're addressing the issue," he announced, but no one paid attention. Their focus was on Harold, the old man standing firm in the aisle, steady despite the chaos around them. He appeared to understand something they didn't, and in their fear, they held on to that faint sliver of confidence. Harold knew the flames would soon damage the hydraulic lines running beside the avionics bay. When that happened, they wouldn't just be flying blind, they'd be trapped. Time was slipping away, and the only obstacle in his path was a man who saw him as a problem instead of a solution. Fuller kept up his performance of being in control, shouting instructions at the flight attendants as they moved around with tense, unsteady urgency. He viewed himself as the defender of the moment, the barrier between order and chaos. To him, Harold was just another factor to handle, another passenger who didn't grasp the situation. The older man's steady composure stood out and it bothered him. "What's with the watch?" Fuller asked sharply, noticing the item on Harold's wrist for the first time. It was an old, oversized chronograph. The steel case was worn and marked, and the leather strap showed deep creases from years of use. It looked like something from a display shelf. "Your grandfather give you that? Maybe it can tell you when we're all going to die." The remark was harsh, fueled by fear and irritation. Harold lowered his eyes to the watch. Its face held a complicated setup of dials and hands, the crystal marked by countless scratches. He didn't see an outdated accessory. He remembered the dim glow of its luminous markings inside a smoke-filled cockpit, the only light available as he struggled with the controls of a damaged aircraft in dangerous airspace. He recalled the brief look of fear on his young co-pilot's face in that same faint green glow just before everything outside had turned to white. The watch was a reminder of a day he had survived when survival wasn't expected. A symbol of a promise made to someone who hadn't returned. It reminded him that he had confronted death before. Harold met Fuller's eyes again, his expression steady. The insult hadn't affected him. It simply faded away, unable to break through the quiet, solid presence he carried. The plane suddenly dipped a few hundred feet in a burst of turbulence, and another wave of screams echoed through the cabin. The situation had become critical. Smoke was getting thicker, slipping through the seams around the cockpit door. The flight crew, overwhelmed by protocol and fear, was unable to act. Fuller was focused on the wrong danger entirely. Harold understood that unless they reached someone on the ground, someone who truly spoke the language of aviation, their remaining time would be counted in minutes. His eyes scanned the cabin, not with panic, but with steady, deliberate intent. He was searching for something useful. He spotted it when a flight attendant stumbled, her service satchel spilling across the aisle. Mixed in with packets of antiseptic wipes and tiny liquor bottles was a small handheld emergency radio, the type used for ground communication with a line-of-sight range that might, in theory, reach someone below. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. He acted quickly. His speed was unexpected for a man his age, a smooth, efficient motion that hinted at training long buried in his past. He grabbed the radio before Fuller even processed what was happening. "What do you think you're doing?" Fuller shouted, lunging toward him. But he didn't make it far. A young woman in a university sweatshirt instinctively stretched her leg into the aisle, causing Fuller to trip and fall awkwardly. "Sorry," she said, her tone carrying no real apology. At the same moment, a young man in an army uniform, a private first class heading home, stood and stepped between Fuller and Harold, positioning himself as a barrier. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, a quiet but firm presence. He had noticed the same thing the student had, a steady competence in the old man that the loud air marshal clearly lacked. Their choice was obvious. Fuller pushed himself up, his face flushed with anger. "You are all under arrest. You're obstructing a federal officer." But everyone could hear the emptiness in his voice. Harold had already turned away, holding a small radio. He adjusted the dials with slow, careful movements, his older hands struggling with the tiny knobs. The young army private leaned closer. "Need help with that, sir?" "The guard channel," Harold said, his gravelly voice low. 243 megahertz. "It's a long shot." The soldier moved quickly and confidently. He tuned the radio, static crackling through the speaker, then handed it back. "It's set, sir." Harold lifted the radio toward his mouth. Fuller tried pushing past the soldier, yelling about rules and consequences, but no one acknowledged him. The entire cabin stayed silent, focused on the old man holding the radio. Everyone waited. Harold pressed the transmit button. His first attempt broke apart in static. He tried again, his tone now firm and controlled, like it belonged to someone from a different time in his life. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian flight 739er. Any military unit monitoring guard, do you copy?" He paused, listening. Static answered. He took one more breath and spoke again, this time including the 6 words that changed everything. "Requesting immediate assistance. This is Ugly 6. I repeat, Ugly 6 is on board and assuming command." The message went out into the wide, indifferent sky, like a voice from a failing aircraft reaching for help. At the Air Route Traffic Control Center in Aurora, Illinois, everything appeared as steady rows of green blips on dark screens. But one blip was gone. Flight 739 had disappeared from radar 10 minutes earlier, leaving only questions behind. The phones had already begun ringing. A quiet tension was building among the controllers. Then, over a speaker reserved for the emergency guard frequency, A voice cut through the static. It was faint and distorted. A junior controller barely registered it, almost dismissing it as atmospheric interference. Civilian Flight 73-9er. Ugly 6. On board and assuming command. The junior controller frowned. Ugly 6? What is that? Some kind of prank? Behind him, a man sprang up from his desk so quickly that his chair slammed into the wall. It was Marks, a senior supervisor and retired Air Force colonel, a man who had seen it all. Normally calm, his face was now pale. Get me a fix on that transmission, Marks barked, his voice cutting across the control room. Scramble the nearest alert fighters. Tell them it's a Nightingale event. I want 2 jets on that plane's wing, 5 minutes ago. The room, previously tense and frozen, erupted into action. Controllers who had been staring helplessly at empty screens now had a purpose. A Nightingale event. Most of them didn't even know what that meant. It was an old code, buried so deeply it was almost mythical. Marks was already on a red phone, a direct line to NORAD. This is Aurora Center. We have a Nightingale declaration. I repeat, Nightingale declaration from call sign Ugly 6. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then a voice came through, a 2-star general, sharp and clear. Confirm call sign. Ugly 6. Confirmed. Another pause. The general's voice tightened. My God, is the file active? Marks's fingers flew across a terminal, accessing a system he hadn't touched in 20 years. A file appeared. Most of it was blacked out, heavily redacted, but 2 words were visible. Lawson, Harold. Below them the call sign. Ugly 6. File is active, General, Mark said, his voice trembling slightly. It's him. Colonel Lawson. He's on that plane. The general's orders were immediate and absolute. The full force of the U.S. military was now focused on a single point in the sky over the Midwest. The legend was alive, and he needed assistance. Back on Flight 739, Air Marshal Fuller had finally managed to shove. He pushed past the young soldier and lunged at Harold, his face twisted with pure anger. His authority had collapsed and fear now ruled his actions. Give me the radio, old man, he growled, gripping Harold's shoulder. I swear I'll restrain you. You're a danger to this aircraft. You're probably the reason all this is happening. It was his final, desperate move. By labeling Harold as the threat, he could try to regain some control. He was prepared to physically force the 83-year-old into a seat and secure him. He had been pushed beyond reason, his training and judgment consumed by the escalating crisis. The other passengers protested, shouting in alarm, but Fuller didn't hear them. He was committed to his fatal mistake, convinced he was the hero. It was the last arrogant act of a man blind to the upheaval about to hit him. Then it happened, silently. One moment, there was only the gray, empty sky outside the windows. The next, 2 sleek, angular shapes appeared, as if materializing from the air itself. F-35 Lightning IIs, the most advanced fighter jets in the world, had joined them. They weren't just near the plane, they were glued to its wings. Cockpits so close that passengers could see the pilots, helmeted and perfectly still. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. The raw, predatory beauty of the machines was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They moved through the sky with silent, deadly grace. The sight was sudden and overwhelming, shocking the cabin into absolute silence. The sobbing stopped. The shouting faded. Every eye was fixed on the jets beside them. Fuller froze, his hand still on Harold's shoulder, mouth agape. Like everyone else, he feared the worst. They had been identified as a threat and were headed for their doom. Then a new voice crackled through the plane's internal system. Clear, calm, and authoritative, it wasn't coming from a flight attendant's handset. It was patched in from outside. Ugly 6, this is Viper 1. We have you on our wing. Your signal is weak, but we read you. Command is on the line. What is your status, sir? The word lingered in the air. Electric. Fuller's hand dropped from Harold's shoulder as if it had been burned. His face, once flushed with rage, drained to a pale, stunned white. He glanced between the fighter jet outside the window and the elderly man in the aisle, unable to comprehend what was happening. The F-35 pilot's voice, Viper 1, came again, this time addressing the entire aircraft. Civilian Aircraft 73-9er, this is Viper 1 of the United States Air Force. We are responding to a Priority 1 Nightingale distress call from Colonel Harold Lawson. Please grant communication authority to him immediately. I repeat, all flight authority is now deferred to Colonel Lawson. The name reverberated through the cabin. Colonel Harold Lawson. The quiet, unassuming man in worn shoes. Viper 1 continued, his tone now deep and almost reverent. For the crew of 73-9er, the call sign Ugly 6 was retired in 1971. Its last holder flew a non-desated airframe over the Asha Valley. After catastrophic system failure, he guided his aircraft and crew home using only a magnetic compass and the watch on his wrist. That man is on your aircraft. I suggest you listen to him. A ripple of understanding, pure awe, spread through the passengers. For the first time they truly saw Harold. Not as a frail elderly man, but as a living legend, a figure who had just awakened from a long slumber. The young soldier who had assisted him snapped to perfect attention in the aisle. The student who had tripped Fuller covered her mouth in shock. Fuller himself appeared struck by lightning, staggering back as his authority crumbled under a force he could not comprehend. Harold was no longer just a passenger. He was the commander. The radio in his hand crackled again. This time, the voice was older, gruffer, carrying the unmistakable weight of command. It was the general from NORAD. Ugly 6, this is Sonundeville. Good to hear your voice, Colonel. It's been a while. Sonundeville, Harold replied, his tone steady as if speaking with an old friend over coffee. We have an avionics fire. Cockpit is unresponsive. Presumed lost. We're flying with compromised hydraulics and running low on fuel in the starboard engine. Understood. Ugly 6, Vipers 1 and 2 will guide you in. They'll provide the glide path to Green Valley Air National Guard Base. The runway is being phoned right now. Can you take the controls? Negative. Harold said the door is sealed, but I can guide someone through it. There's a first officer, a young, terrified pilot. He needs a calm, steady voice. The plane's first officer stammered over the internal comms patched through by the fighter jets. Sir, Colonel Lawson. I can hear you. I don't know what to do. Harold went to work immediately. His voice became precise and calm, cutting through the young pilot's panic. He instructed on dumping fuel, managing the failing engine, and preparing the cabin for a high-speed emergency landing. He conducted the process with methodical precision, orchestrating a survival strategy under extreme pressure. Then the voice of General Sonundeville returned on the line one last time, directed at the Air Marshal. Agent Fuller, your service weapon has been flagged. Your credentials are suspended pending a full review of your conduct. You will provide Colonel Lawson with full and unconditional cooperation. You will not speak unless addressed. Is that understood? Fuller could only manage a choked, weak nod, feeling his career and identity collapse under a public reprimand. After guiding the first officer through the critical steps for landing, Harold turned to the broken Air Marshal. There was no triumph in his eyes. No vindication. Only quiet sadness. Fear makes you deaf, son, Harold said softly, barely above a whisper. It's a cage you build yourself. Courage isn't about avoiding the cage, it's about finding the key. Harold glanced down at the old watch on his wrist, its worn face a testament to a lifetime of unlocking those keys. He remembered a flash of fire and twisted metal. He was young again, hanging upside down in the cockpit of a strange, bat-winged aircraft that should never have existed. Smoke filled his lungs. His pilot, Jesse, was gone. His navigator, Mike, was bleeding beside him. Mike had given him the watch just a week earlier. For good luck, he had said. As Mike's life faded, he grasped Harold's arm. They called us the Ugly 6 because there were 6 of us and the bird was ugly as sin, he coughed, blood staining his lips. But you get them all home. You're the Ugly 6 now. Harold had flown that broken, ugly machine across a border it had no business crossing, navigating by the stars in that watch, carrying the ghosts of his friends with him. The call sign was a burden, a promise, and an honor, a piece of his soul he thought he had buried forever. The landing was violent. A bone-jarring, screeching arrival as the crippled 777 hit the foam-covered runway at Green Valley. Yet the fuselage held, the landing gear held. Harold's instructions, relayed from the aisle to a terrified first officer he had never met, had been flawless. As the plane slowed to a stop, surrounded by fire trucks and emergency vehicles, a profound silence filled the cabin. Then someone started clapping. The applause grew, swelling into a thunderous, tearful ovation, not for the pilot, but for the old man who refused to sit down. When the emergency slides deployed and doors opened, the first person to step up was not a paramedic, but the 4-star general from the radio. He ignored everyone else, scanning the cabin until he found Harold. Walking down the aisle, the clapping fell silent. He stopped in front of Harold, his posture rigid, and rendered a salute so sharp it seemed to cut the air. Colonel Lawson, the general said, his voice thick with emotion. It is an honor, sir. Harold, the unassuming hero, slowly and wearily returned the salute. In the weeks that followed, Flight 739 became a quiet legend. The FAA and the Air Marshal Service launched a joint investigation. Agent Fuller was reassigned to a basement desk pending forced retirement. A new training module, unofficially called the Lawson Protocol, was developed to teach federal agents and flight crews to recognize and utilize unconventional assets during a crisis, to value quiet competence over loud authority. The airline sent Harold a formal apology and offered free flights for life. He politely declined. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Harold sat in a small coffee shop near his home, reading a newspaper. The bell above the door chimed, and a man hesitated inside. It was Fuller, no suit, just a plain polo and jeans, looking diminished. He approached Harold's table. "Colonel Lawson," he said quietly. Harold looked up, expression neutral, and nodded. "I wanted to apologize," Fuller stammered, twisting a napkin in his hands. "For how I treated you. There's no excuse. I was scared and you were right. I was in a cage. I'm sorry." Harold folded his newspaper and placed it on the table. He gestured to the empty chair. "Sit down, son. Let me buy you a cup of coffee." Fuller sat. For a long time, the two men simply sat in silence as the rain washed the world outside, a quiet understanding passing between them. A lesson learned, a moment of grace offered and accepted. If this story of unassuming courage moved you, please share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the heroes who walk among us every day.